The date has been fixed, and there is no road back from it now. The palace did not move because of ceremony, it moved because of time. For months, the machinery of the crown had been running on patience, on schedules written in pencil, on the quiet understanding that some decisions could wait until the morning felt right. That morning has now passed. What was sealed this week behind the walls of Windsor was not a celebration, not an announcement in the ordinary sense, but a transfer of inevitability, a private acknowledgement made between a father and a son that the future had stopped being theoretical. No cameras recorded it, no aides spoke of it, no corridor leaked it by accident. It was a decision made in the oldest way the monarchy knows, in silence, in writing, and in the presence of witnesses who understood they were watching history arrange itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room, according to a documented private account, was smaller than anyone would expect. Not the grand state apartments, not the white and gold corridors where portraits of dead monarchs watch every footstep. A private drawing room at Windsor, the kind with worn fabric on the chairs and curtains drawn against the late afternoon, because the family has always preferred its heaviest conversations to take place where the light is soft and the walls do not perform. On the table between two armchairs sat a single leather folder, dark green, unmarked, the kind of folder the royal household uses when a document is not meant to be photographed, summarized, or casually mentioned. Inside it was a schedule, not a draft, a schedule. The king arrived first. That mattered because punctuality in that family is never accidental. It is a language. He stood for a moment at the window, looking out over the parkland he had walked as a younger man, back when the crown was a horizon and not a weight. William was announced. The door closed. And in that closing of the door, courtiers who had served 3 reigns understood that something irreversible had begun. What passed between them was not an argument. It was not a negotiation. It was an accounting. The folder was opened. A date was spoken aloud for the first time outside the smallest planning circle in Britain. And once a date is spoken aloud in that family, it acquires a kind of gravity that no later hesitation can escape. That mattered because the monarchy does not deal in intentions. It deals in fixtures. A fixture had been made. For William, the moment was not a triumph. It was a threshold. Those who have observed him across 2 decades describe a man who has spent his entire adult life walking toward a door he was never allowed to rush toward and never permitted to avoid. He is the reluctant successor in its purest form, not reluctant to serve, but reluctant to arrive, because arrival in his world is inseparable from loss. Every step toward that chair is a step away from his father. He understood, sitting in that room, that the folder in front of him was not really about crowns or choirs or the abbey. It was about time. Specifically, about how much of it remained. For Catherine, the moment carried a different weight. She was not in the room, and that absence was itself a decision. The steady stabilizer of this generation has always known when her presence would clarify and when it would complicate. Through a documented private account, she was told within the hour. Not consulted, told. And those who know her well say she received the date the way she receives everything that matters, without visible flinch, without performance, with the stillness of a person who had already rehearsed this moment in her own mind 100 times. Her stillness was not detachment. It was preparation completed early. For the king, it was something else entirely. The fading center is a cruel archetype, and he has worn it with more dignity than the role usually allows. He waited 70 years for the crown he now holds, and the arithmetic of his reign has never been a secret to him. To set a coronation date for his son is to acknowledge, in writing, the limits of his own chapter. There is no modern precedent for how a monarch carries that. In a family memorandum later preserved, the mood of that afternoon was described not as sorrow, but as the order of a man putting his house in sequence. That mattered because Charles has spent his whole reign insisting on duty as an organizing principle. And this was duty at its most personal, the duty to make one's own ending administrable. And for Camilla, watching from the edge of the arrangement, the day brought its own quiet recalculation. The displaced insider knows that every coronation redraws the map of proximity, who stands where, who is consulted first, whose name travels in which order on the documents that actually govern things. She has navigated the palace longer than almost anyone now serving, and she understands that a date is never just a date. It is the first stone in a new architecture. Hers was not grief and not fear. It was the attentiveness of a survivor reading the weather. There was one more figure in that emotional constellation, and he was 3,000 miles away. No account suggests Harry was in the room, in the call, or in the circle of knowledge. The absent brother has become a kind of negative space in every major family decision, present in every conversation, precisely by not being present. The folder on that table had no page for him. That silence, too, was a decision. And it was not the last silence that week. But the room scene was not the beginning. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to an earlier evening, months before, when the folder did not yet exist, and the date was still only a fear with a calendar attached. It began, according to a recorded internal note, at a private dinner. No officials, no photographers, no agenda circulated in advance, just family, and one guest whose role was medical rather than ceremonial. The dinner was warm on its surface. The conversation moved easily through grandchildren, through estates, through the safe territory families retreat to when unsafe territory is sitting at the table with them. But somewhere between the main course and the coffee, the conversation turned. It turned the way such conversations always turn in that family. Not with an announcement, but with a question asked slightly too carefully. The subject was resilience. How the king was carrying the schedule. What the autumn would look like. And the answer that came back, delivered with clinical gentleness, changed the emotional physics of the room. No one raised a voice, no one put down a fork. But William, by the account preserved from that evening, went very quiet, and Catherine's hand found his under the table. And the king kept talking about duty, about continuity, about how the institution must always be ready to outlast the individual. He was not being morbid. He was being a monarch. That mattered because it was the first time the family had treated the future not as a distant fact but as an item requiring preparation. After that dinner, the machinery began to stir in ways almost no one outside the household could detect. A coronation, in simple terms, is not planned in months. It is planned in layers, some of them years deep, and the outline framework for the next one, the rehearsal notes, the guest architecture. The liturgical skeleton had existed in draft since before the current reign even began. Every reign maintains such a file. It is not morbid, it is constitutional housekeeping. But after that dinner, the file stopped being housekeeping. It acquired an owner. It acquired a rhythm. Quiet meetings began appearing in diaries under neutral descriptions. The Lord Chamberlain's office, which is, in plain language, the department that runs the operational life of the monarchy, from ceremonies to staffing, began holding sessions that were not on any published schedule. And there was a rehearsal. Through a documented private account, a walkthrough was conducted at the Abbey itself, in the early morning, before the doors opened to the public. William stood at the spot where the chair waits, and the empty building held its silence around him, and those few present said afterward that he did not speak for a long time. He simply stood where his son or his grief would one day stand, measuring it. That was the moment the abstraction became geography. A date could now be attached to a place, and a place once chosen is very hard to unchoose. The confrontation, when it came, did not look like a confrontation. It looked like a meeting. It took place between William and a senior figure of the household, a man whose whole career had been the management of transition, whose loyalty was to the crown itself rather than to any single wearer of it. The office was unremarkable. The tea was poured, and then the folder appeared on the desk, and the atmosphere changed from administrative to geological. William's position, according to the internal record of that discussion, was not refusal. It was resistance of a more subtle kind. The resistance of a son asking whether acceleration was necessary, whether the institution was preparing for the future or quietly surrendering the present. He asked how much of this was planning and how much of it was prognosis. He asked who had decided that the schedule could no longer remain in pencil. He asked, in effect, whether the machinery was following the king or leading him. The silence that followed was the longest of the meeting. No papers moved, no tea was sipped. And then the answer came, and it was not the answer of a courtier defending a process. It was the answer of a man who had been given an instruction by the king himself. The date was not being imposed on the family. The date had been requested by the family by the one person with the standing to request it. Charles wanted it fixed. He wanted his son's road laid out in ink while he was still there to see it laid. He wanted, in the oldest royal sense, to settle his affairs. That admission changed everything in the room. Resistance requires an opponent, and there was no opponent left, only a father's stated wish and a son's unavoidable answer. William, by the account preserved from that session, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, and then he said the only thing left to say. He asked to see the schedule, not whether it should exist, what it contained. The conversation had crossed its line, and everyone in the room knew it. That mattered because the monarchy runs on such crossings. No announcement is ever the real event. The real event is always the private moment when someone stops asking whether and starts asking how. And then the machinery moved, and it moved with the terrible elegance of an institution that has rehearsed this exact transition for 1,000 years. The royal diary, the master calendar, in simple terms, from which every engagement, every audience, every state commitment flows, began to show gaps. Quietly at first, a regional visit recategorized, a foreign tour described as under review, empty spaces appearing where certainty used to live, the way a tide withdraws before the wave. To the public, nothing looked different. To those who read diaries for a living, the pattern was unmistakable. Room was being made. That mattered because calendars in that world are confessions. An empty week is a louder statement than any press release. The Privy Council, the ancient body of senior advisors, through which the constitutional formalities of succession actually travel, saw its preparatory paperwork refreshed. The Accession Council, which is the ceremonial assembly that formally proclaims a new sovereign, had its standing arrangements reviewed, its lists checked, its logistics quietly walked through. None of this was secret in the sinister sense. All of it was routine in the constitutional sense. But routine, performed at unusual tempo, is its own kind of signal. Folders multiplied. Drafts acquired version numbers. A seating architecture for the abbey, which living members of the family would occupy which rows, which foreign royals would be ranked in which order, began moving between offices in unmarked envelopes. Objects in this story were doing the talking that people would not. And there were the smaller objects, the ones only the household would notice. A set of briefing cards updated. A rehearsal timetable printed on the heavy cream paper reserved for documents of state. In one office, a photograph on a mantel, the king and his heir at an earlier ceremony, both smiling, was repositioned so that it faced the door, the first thing a visitor would see. No one explained the repositioning, no one needed to. In a family memorandum, later preserved, this period was described simply as the season when the palace began leaning forward. Catherine's role in the machinery was distinct and deliberate. She attended no logistics meetings. She approved no schedules. Instead, she did what she has always done. She fixed the human foundations beneath the institutional ones. The children's routines were stabilized. The household at home was insulated from the tempo of the palace. Through a documented private account, she asked one operational question, and only one about timing relative to the school year, and the planners understood immediately that this was not curiosity. It was a boundary. Whatever the crown needed, the children would be shielded from the blast radius. That mattered because in this family, the next generation is not an abstraction. It is the entire point of the exercise, and she intended it to arrive intact. Then came the second warning, and with it, the end of all ambiguity. It arrived not as drama, but as documentation, an updated assessment, circulated through the smallest possible channel, that recast the timeline the planners had been working with. The details of such assessments are never public, and they were not public here. What is known is the effect. Within days, the tempo changed again. Drafts that had been circulating for comment came back approved. Dates that had been offered as ranges hardened into single entries. The green leather folder, which had lived for weeks in the private space between father and son, began appearing in formal settings, carried by people whose job it is to carry things that matter. The decision had left the family room and entered the state, and once a royal decision enters the state, it does not come back. There was no panic. That is the thing outsiders consistently misunderstand about that institution. There was, instead, a grim acceleration, the controlled urgency of people who have gamed out every scenario and are now simply executing the one that reality selected. Security planners reviewed routes. Clergy reviewed orders of service. The stone of destiny, the ancient block of sandstone, In simple terms, the ceremonial seat of coronations for centuries had its arrangements quietly confirmed. Every object in the chain was being touched, checked, and readied. The palace was not bracing for an event, it was building one. And through it all, the family kept performing normality, with the discipline of people for whom performance is a form of loyalty. Engagements were carried out, smiles were delivered on schedule. The public face of the monarchy did not flicker once, because flickering is the one luxury that institution has never permitted itself. But institutions do not have to live with decisions. People do. And so the story narrows now to its smallest room. It was evening, at home, away from the state apartments and the unmarked folders. William and Catherine, in the kind of domestic setting that the public rarely imagines for them a kitchen. 2 cups of tea going slowly cold, the particular exhaustion of people who have spent the day being symbols and have finally been allowed to stop. Through a documented private account, the conversation that night was not about the crown at all. It was about his father. William spoke first, and what he said was not strategy. It was the confession of a son who had spent the afternoon approving logistics for an event whose precondition was the one thing he could not approve. He said he felt like he was building something on his father's horizon. He said every planning session felt like a betrayal executed politely. He said the date, now that it existed, sat in his chest like a held breath. Catherine listened in the way she has always listened, completely, without reaching for comfort before comfort was ready. And then she answered, and her answer, preserved in that account, was the hinge of the whole story. She told him that he was not taking anything. He was being handed something by the one person with the right to hand it over, and that the distinction was everything. She told him that readiness was not disloyalty, that it was, in fact, the final form loyalty takes. She told him that his father had not asked for mourning. He had asked for order, and giving him order was the most loving act available to them. They sat with that for a while. 2 people, no titles in the room, just a husband and a wife at a kitchen table with cold tea, doing arithmetic of the heart that no courtier could do for them. And when they rose, something had settled. The folder on the desk upstairs was no longer an accusation. It was an inheritance, accepted. That mattered because every coronation in history has rested not on the ceremony, but on the private moment when the heir stopped resisting the shape of his own life. That moment had now happened. The rest was choreography. And then the choreography met the public, and the private machinery became a national event. The confirmation, when it surfaced, moved through the country the way weather moves felt everywhere before it was understood anywhere. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, the gathering began within hours, and it was not a celebration crowd and not a mourning crowd, but something older than both. The crowd of a nation checking that its story is still intact. People stood in silence with their phones lowered, which in this century is the truest form of reverence. Flowers appeared at the railings, not in grief but in acknowledgement, the public's way of saying it had understood the weight of what had been fixed. One woman, speaking to a reporter through tears she seemed surprised by, said she had come because her mother had watched the last coronation on a black and white television, and now she would watch the next one, and it felt like the country was passing through a doorway, and she did not want to miss standing in the doorway. That quote, unattributed and unpolished, traveled further than any official statement, because it contained what statements never can. The recognition that monarchy, at its core, is a family's private timeline made unbearably public, and that the public knows it. The front pages the next morning told the story in their own grammar. One carried a single stark headline above a photograph of father and son walking side by side, a headline built around the word set, because set was the word that mattered, the word that ended the era of pencil and began the era of ink. Another front page chose no photograph of ceremony at all, but a quiet image of the king alone, and let the white space do the speaking. Broadcasters framed the moment with the careful solemnity reserved for constitutional turning points. One leading anchor opening his program with a line that would be repeated all day. That the monarchy had not announced an ending. It had announced a continuation, and that in Britain, continuation is the louder of the two. In pubs and offices and school gates, the conversation had the same shape everywhere. Not gossip about crowns and carriages, but something more primal: fathers and sons, time and readiness, the universal terror of the moment when the next generation stops preparing and starts arriving. The story had escaped the palace walls and become what all great royal stories become: a mirror. People were not really discussing William. They were discussing themselves, their own parents, their own unspoken schedules. And back inside the walls, the family watched the reaction with the detachment of people for whom public emotion is a familiar weather system. But those close to the household noted one detail, preserved in a private account. On the evening the confirmation spread, the king asked for the front pages to be brought to him, and he read them in order, slowly, and then he asked whether his son had seen them. He had. Nothing more was recorded, nothing more needed to be. The father had set the date, the son had accepted the road, the nation had understood both. So the verdict of this chapter, when the noise settles and the folder is archived, and the green leather returns to its shelf, is not about a date at all. It is about the three currencies in which that family has always traded, and how each was spent here. William gave the moment honesty, the rare, unguarded admission that readiness and grief are the same door seen from opposite sides. Catherine gave it grace, the steadiness that turns a constitutional mechanism back into a human passage, walked by people and not by titles. And the king gave it the hardest gift a monarch can give: his blessing written in advance on a future that will not include him as its center. No one in that drawing room at Windsor pretended otherwise. There were no illusions in that room, no easy words, no comfort offered cheaply. There was a folder, a date, a father and a son, and the ancient, unbroken understanding that the crown survives precisely because the people beneath it do not flinch from the arithmetic of their own lives. The date is set, the road is laid in ink, and somewhere in a quiet kitchen, 2 cups of tea went cold while the future of a 1,000-year institution was settled not by committees or councils, but by a wife telling her husband that he was ready, and a son finally believing her. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.